Welcome to Warwick Business School's Core Insights podcast on fintech. This is the fifth in a series of podcasts on fintech with the school's Gillmore Centre for Financial Technology. In this series, with the help of the centre's world-class researchers and professors, and alongside some fantastic guests from around the fintech industry, we're exploring the big issues as the financial sector continues to grapple with exciting new technologies. My name is Natasha de Teran, and I'm your host today, asking the questions to find out just where fintech is heading. Today, we're going to ask whether AI can save ESG. A lot of acronyms there. To answer this, I'm joined by Seth Sheldon, Noah Miller, and Isabel Fischer. Let me introduce them briefly. Seth Sheldon is a PhD, Chief Scientific Officer and founder of Rho Impact. He holds a PhD in Environmental Science from the University of Massachusetts and holds a BS in Earth and Ocean Sciences from Duke University. I'm also joined by Noah Miller, the Chief Advisory Officer and Head of ESG Advisory Service at Rho Impact. Noah holds an MBA in Sustainable Innovation and a BA in Community Development and Applied Economics from the University of Vermont. Noah also holds an MS in Mediation and Applied Conflict Studies from Champlain College. And last but not least, Dr. Isabel Fischer. Dr. Isabel Fischer is an Associate Professor in Information Systems at Warwick Business School, our home to the Gillmore Centre. In this role, she teaches in the area of digital transformation, design thinking for digital innovation, and among others, Isabel's research portfolio, which is very extensive, centres on AI, ethics, and environmental and social sustainability. So welcome to the three of you. Thank you very much for joining us. Noah, before we begin, can you tell me what it is exactly that Rho Impact does and what you two do there?
Sure, absolutely. So we at Rho Impact, we're an ESG and impact advisory and software company with roots dating back to 2012. And we're on a mission to democratize access to ESG and impact tools, capabilities, insights, and support. Seth, anything you'd like to add to what we're doing?
We're especially focused with respect to the impact measurement and management space, IMM, on forecasting for business-to-business companies that have, they may have complex supply chains themselves. They may be a part of complex supply chains. And one of the things that we do is we help them identify and then model, essentially calculate what effect their products, processes, services would have were they to sell them to other companies. It sounds sort of niche, and I guess in some ways it is, but it's really tough because people are coming up with their own calculations, and there's just a lot of there's a lot going on out there in the ESG and impact space for sure. With respect to AI, we apply AI. Of course, our roots with Rho AI. We apply AI in a few different areas, but a lot of what we do, given our history with it, is we're very careful in where it's applied, because if we're not able to explain why a certain set of choices were made or why a number is what it appears to be, then the whole thing collapses ultimately. So that's where we focus a lot of our attention.
And maybe it's worth adding here is the link between me and Rho in Impact is that around 5 years ago, we worked together when Rho Impact was called Rho AI. And the outcome of our work was captured in a teaching case study that is readily available to all. It's open access, and you can see the link in the show notes. So do look through the link. It explains the background on ESG, it explains the background on AI and the link between AI and ESG. And we discuss in this co-authored paper questions like ethics as well. So it provides a very good overview of ethical aspects concerning AI and ESG. So I encourage readers to look at the case in the show notes.
So there's that and other reading material to be found in the show notes. So anyone that's watching or listening, do go to those. Okay, so let's begin. I think there's a lot of skepticism and fear around AI, and perhaps just skepticism, and perhaps less, but just pure skepticism around ESG. So can AI, which many of us fear, save ESG, which many of us don't believe in?
Well, let's go back and ask the question whether actually ESG needs saving. So ESG is controversial. some are in support, and basically ESG, environment and social governance criteria, are quite broad. And it links back to ethics as well, because we actually have to go a little bit further and say, look, it's not just ESG, especially if we're talking about AI. We are also interested in the ethics aspect of it. And so I'm not sure where we want to start, but if we start, so environmental. So one of the first controversy here is that AI uses a lot of energy. So we are, does it need saving and so on? We have a bit of a balance here. AI as a polluter. That's just on the climate change.
So we're polluting to stop pollution.
Absolutely. The other thing is, we had a lot of, in the past, people were complaining about sweatshops for, let's say, clothes. And people say, oh, we can't buy from those stores. But in reality, for AI, everybody's very happy for the data to have been labeled initially under perhaps similar conditions to the clothes. So again, on the social side, we are looking here at AI being a little bit not necessarily that friendly, and governance. Then at the end, is the issue is that many people actually don't really know understand the AI behind the outcome. So, this, at the simplest level, in AI would say, this is an ESG friendly company, yes or no. And what I'm interested in is the explainability, because basically, why is this seen as ESG friendly? Is it the social side? There are not that many who actually understand how AI makes decisions. So how do we know what AI decides on? And
so we need to
verify it.
So to truly understand, we need to know what the inputs are and what the calculations are.
And I don't think we are ready yet. So basically, what I want to say, if we wanted to have a quick answer here, is AI is not ready, as far as I understand. AI is not ready to save ESG.
Okay.
What do the others think about it?
It's a really good question, and one of the elements that popped into my head, maybe it's sort of a cliche or overused, but just thinking about the inverse. Maybe AI needs ESG to be saved. The kind of AI that we want to apply in the world, we need to be thinking about pollution and documenting that. We need to be thinking about how the AI was put together, coded even in the first place, like under what conditions and whose data was used. We need to think about those types of things, and those are all the types of moral and ethical questions, as well as scientific questions that ESG can help kind of tease out. AI wouldn't. It's not going to be. It isn't the first time we've gotten really enamored with the kind of technology that we thought was going to fix everything, that just ended up creating more problems. I mean, there's sort of a phrase that's used in some environmental science context where, like, every the source of every problem was a solution, and we see that all the time. So I think it's, there's certainly an interplay between these things. And I think that there are probably elements of, ESG, of impact measurement and management. Sometimes we call that IMM, just to throw out another acronym for everybody, where, AI and methods that folks, consider to be AI, can be applied to do a better job with what we're trying to do. But there's always this kind of human element, and that's the thing that we can't forget in any of it. I mean, I'm in general agreement that AI as a broad kind of field isn't ready to do all the things that we're asking of it, but it can do some things really, really well. And there are applications, I think, that maybe we'll get into later, that where it does have a good effect. But for ESG, in general, if it's all right, I'd want to pass the mic over to Noah a little bit, just zooming out, to talk
Please.
about ESG as a concept.
Yeah, well, maybe great points. And maybe let's take a step back and just, for all the viewers and listeners out there, discuss how are we contextualizing ESG and acronym, woke business. What are we talking about? So at the end of the day, ESG is just an acronym for environmental, social, and governance. And what we're talking about ultimately is a management framework for addressing the risks and opportunities of a changing environment, changing stakeholder requirements and needs, and a changing economic conditions. So really, we're talking about management at the end of the day. If we look at the most high level order of what are we thinking when we talk about these issues as they relate to business, at the end of the day, we know that any business that's more responsive to their stakeholders, their customers, investors, employees, suppliers, is going to be more resilient and responsive to changes in the business conditions that they're operating with on a daily basis. And, as a non-technical person, what I have really learned to appreciate about AI and ESG is it can really reduce a lot of the complexity in the inherent information gathering that really makes, manual analysts, their eyes bleed at the end of the day, sorting through thousands of documents. But what it won't be able to do in the near term is account for all the change management required, all of the changing of people, processes, policies, protocols, what it requires of people's skill sets and capabilities. So I think, putting AI in the context of a great tool to accelerate I would say the real work, I see a lot of value in that. And I'm seeing very clearly with Isabel and Seth's points that there are very clear barriers to what can be done today as it relates to, a panacea for all of these complex ESG data governance challenges, measurement challenges, et cetera.
No, can I just ask about the data gathering and that you talked about that sort of heavy lifting. So this is data of historical and present data. So in other words, the AI would show me what I have done or what I am doing, rather than be telling me what I could do. Or do I need that data to find out what I could do? Or are you thinking about this in the reporting context?
So I think at the end of the day, there are thousands of documents, practically speaking, that need to be sorted through. And that's where human error is really, really, stumbling the whole process.
But that does presuppose that information is available and accurate to begin with. I mean, AI can't invent the data. Humans are quite good at inventing the data when it's not there, but AI presumably not yet.
One of the things that we've been kind of having fun as with other folks is playing around with ChatGPT, for instance, seeing what it does. And I guess one of the major problems with those is that if it can't find the data, it will hallucinate. And and then we actually asked this question a while back, and our principal scientists at Rho Impact ended up digging into one of the kind of prompts, and then the response that we got saying like, hey, can you tell me what the emissions intensity is in the supply chain for dried mung beans, right? Here's a really specific example. And by the way, tell me where you got those numbers. And by the way, give me the link to where you got those numbers. Several months ago, it dutifully and energetically printed out the entire list. So our scientist, principal scientist, she went in and she was like, she checked. I was like, oh, this is neat. Maybe I'll check this later. She went in and checked and found that half the papers that it cited didn't have any of the numbers. It was a totally different topic. And the other half weren't real papers. And then, a couple months ago, we rechecked the same prompt, and it now apologizes in advance, and it doesn't want to give us the impression that what it was telling us was factual. I'm like, oh my God. So maybe it's like AI can in certain instances be quite good at making stuff up.
We might be able to make up sources in the future as well, which would be just as worrying. Isabel, you wanted to jump in.
Well, I just think it gives us a false sense of confidence. A lot of things, and then the research has shown, is actually one of my core papers as well, is just seeing like color schemes. And if you think, it looks green for ESG and red if it's not good for ESG, and people then actually don't question things anymore. They're sitting at let's say you're meeting for your bank, you decide, actually, my investment is meant to be good for the environment or for social governance criteria. I'm going to see a bank and I say, look, I want to have ESG criteria. And they then very much removed from the initial calculation and initial, what I called before, it's like this black box environment. So they don't know what's happening. They just go, this is green here for ESG. So that should be an ESG investment. And I think the issue is with AI is that we coming back to the point of explainability, and that's where I want to hear from the Rho Impact people. It's actually, I think AI has to be much better in explaining its decision making so that others can really believe in it, rather than blindly trusting a color scheme of this is now an ESG green investment.
As you answer that, Rho Impact, can what I'd like to know in understanding the answer to that question is, as a company, I need to report ESG, my ESG statistics to my investors. So I ought to understand the calculations. But unless my investors can understand the calculations as well, it's completely meaningless, because I might be happy with some quite dubious assumptions and calculations. But it's really my investors that need to have that transparency. And I guess the question is, will they be getting that?
So I'll pass it to Seth in a moment, who is our impact measurement guru at Rho Impact. But from an advisory standpoint, and in terms of what needs to be provided for information to appear, credible, transparent, traceable, is really ensuring that both the numbers are there, all of the numbers that AI supports, and sort of the data crunching, the information gathering, the carbon accounting, et cetera. But the narrative also needs to be very clear and coherent in terms of what is the business doing from a risk and opportunity management standpoint? How are they overseeing it internally and monitoring ESG implementation? What are their targets and KPIs? This is the context that makes those numbers usable and actionable. But without it, it becomes still, we've met our disclosure requirements, but we still don't know what it means to us, nor to how to explain it to our investors, because we don't have the context to really unpack those numbers. So I would say it's having the numbers is critical, but without the context, it might as well be a greenwashing scenario, because you can't substantiate where the numbers came from, what they mean, or what it means for the future of the business.
I think there'd be nothing more frustrating than having this absolutely brilliant analysis, right? You go in there and you count every number, everything that can be measured is measured. You have every third party review of the approach and methodology, and then you don't stick the landing because you didn't put the narrative together in a way that made sense to any of the other people, like who were reviewing it or decision makers. That's a kind of hell, I would imagine, for analysts to be in. The flip side of that, and as we're talking about the importance of traceability in the calculations and the logic and accessibility in it, it's not an easy thing to address. The flip side of it is having something that is either totally black box, you're just taking it for granted that it's the green versus red kind of notion that people will trust, whether they should or not. And that ultimately doesn't have anything, there's nothing under the hood, so to speak. Like, you go in and you think that it's doing the thing that it appears to be doing, but it is not. And that really is greenwashing. I think true greenwashing.
I can see, as a large organization, I'm a very large manufacturing international organization with multiple shareholders listed, and nicely wherever I'm listed, I can see I've got the wherewithal. Admittedly, my task is very complex in terms of my reporting and so forth, and the logic has to be very complicated. But I do have the resources to address this, and indeed to perhaps make the logic clear to the people that need to understand it. But what about smaller organizations? How are they going to deal with these problems? Because they're just as important. There's many more small companies who are all part of these supply chains. And how are they going to get access to this kind of logic, this kind of capabilities, and be able to, one, understand the black boxes, and two, explain upstream and downstream the inputs and outputs?
Right. Just one quick example that might be helpful or useful for our discussion here. Like how are the smaller companies that make up our supply chains and that are an integral part of the overall impact that we as consumers, as well as the businesses that we're directly buying from, how are we going to get the numbers right? One example would be like Watt Time, which they've been around for a little while. They're a nonprofit. They do something really cool, and they apply AI to do it, where they come up with, as accurately as they can, close to real-time estimates of the GHG intensity of the grid. So if you go in and say, like, I use this amount of electricity at this factory, you just plug in the numbers, and they'll give you, close to a real-time review of what your scope 2 electricity-based emissions are reporting worth. They're a nonprofit, and it's been a major project for them. That's like an example of a tool where there's no way that any individual company could have gotten it right. For years in the US, we've had the EPA eGrid, which is like a very, I wouldn't say it's rudimentary, but it's geographically fairly low resolution and temporally extremely low resolution in terms of what the GHG intensity is of the grid. And that's just like one of the many factors that you would kind of use. But,
Yeah.
Those kind of tools I think exist, but probably not enough.
And, in terms of the tools, there's also the toolkit from a capability standpoint, which I think is another element back to that kind of human touch that's required, where at the end of the day, for SMEs that are making up the supply chains of some of these big companies, not only are they facing ESG procurement requirements in terms of these companies setting scope 3 emissions goals, having supplier criteria, et cetera, but it also becomes a rat race to who can prove that they're more sustainable than their next person in that procurement battle. And that's really where I think some of the impact measurement commercially becomes really relevant. And, in terms of back to the capability standpoint, not everyone can afford a PwC or Deloitte or McKinsey. And if that was the case, we'd all be in big, if we had to wait for everyone to be able to afford a big group like that to come in. At the end of the day, we're talking about adapting existing functions to account for a couple more issues, not about rearranging the way a business runs. So just to put it into a little more
you might
specific,
be after you've seen the outputs, but yes.
Right, exactly. But not redesigning with the whole kind of McKinsey, we're talking about adapting policies, we're adapting protocols, asking for a little bit more information from who you source from, looking at how do you hire, how do you involve, the community in terms of opportunities for co-creation of deployment of your products and services to address local issues. There's a lot of commercial relevance to it. And it comes back to this, this notion of, is ESG about doing good in the world, or is it about managing the realities of today's business environment? It depends on who you ask. But at the end of the day, we're talking about managing risk and opportunity, and those who do it better are going to have more value to provide and are going to win.
So in the large company context, sort of what gets measured gets managed. In a small company context, most of the things are being managed and there's less time to measure them. And I think this is arguably putting an onus on them where they might sort of mentally measure it on a day-to-day basis, be aware of what they're doing. It's a very different thing to be able to present an output to an upstream client or an investor. That's a different, that's like a new auditing requirement, I think. Now, Isabel, you seem to be quite skeptic.
The next thing I am interested in is actually that I think where we are unfair is with the use of ESG internationally. So we're setting the same standards for all different countries, even though the priorities are different. And I'm not sure if ESG and AI both can cater sufficiently for different backgrounds, different, global south versus global north, and again, interested what Rho Impact thinks. So just for everybody's background, and Rho Impact used to be called Rho AI. And at that point, I worked a lot with Rho AI. So sometimes I still use Rho AI, but yeah, so Rho Impact. Because at the time, it was very US centered. And ESG as such also was to start with very US centered. So how have things progressed? How are you looking on an international scale? Are you changing the algorithms? Do you have a bit of a different standards? How do you, in your tools, how do you cater for those things?
At Rho, we work with, we have an international client base. And I would say, what we believe, and we're in the process of finding out directly from our customers if we are correct on what they found helpful with us. But I think what we've been able to support some of these international groups wrestling with multiple standards, regulations, requirements, pressures, mandates, all the above, is that if you execute on the fundamentals of ESG and impact measurement, you will be compliant with every disclosure regulation. The current focus on getting really smart on regulations is sort of like trying to learn a skill set in a specific language. If you don't speak the language, it's really hard to understand the application of the skill set that you're learning in a different language. As you get more familiar with the language, the issues, the range of ESG issues, it starts to consolidate into, at the end of the day, all these standards are asking, what are your risks and opportunities? What are you doing about it? And how well are you doing it right now? And if we're able to help clients, especially small to medium-sized businesses, get really clear on the business case, the stakeholder value, and being able to get some of those basic numbers in place, it becomes, I'd say, a game changer for these small to medium-sized businesses that could have a lot of value to unlock in the value chain of these larger companies.
Totally. I think it kind of comes down to one of the things that is especially challenging in the ESG and IMM spaces is just impact broadly, is the definition of what a win is pretty different than in a lot of applications of AI. So Rho AI, a flagship product that Rho AI had was Pit Rho. And that was for professional motorsports racing, and
Not so ESG then.
What's it? Yeah, yeah, precisely. Just driving the cars around in a loop. But one of the really interesting things about that, and we talk a lot about this internally, is like that's a really good example of where you can have a definitive outcome. And you know when somebody has won or lost, and you know the set of things that they did in order to change their behaviors and all that. You have other applications of AI where that's true, where the result and the positive or negative result is self-evident, or that you can verify through other means, indirectly, maybe with a very detailed life cycle assessment or something like that. And so it's especially hard, at least at this stage in the game and for the field, and I think the skepticism is justified to trust any of the outputs, because how can you really, if you've got a composite score that came out of a black box model that was allegedly based on big data from somewhere, how would you even verify that it was true? I mean, maybe it's benchmarking, and but it ends up being it ends up being subjective, almost purely subjective, and maybe even biased. Just under another, but presented very as absolute truth. So we think a lot about that, and in terms of where we apply AI, it's the kinds of things that Noah was alluding to earlier. It's things like sorting docs prior to review by people, identifying companies and technologies that are interesting in the field and have relevant technologies that we would want to model. Communication improvements. Interestingly, I was ragging on ChatGPT earlier, but if you need a list of 10 different ways to say something that you think is going to be better at communicating your point, then having the final edit on that is, a fair and usable application. But in every one of those things, and Noah has been our primary champion on this point to drive it home, there's the human element, and we can't forget that in any of these, and we have to continue applying that sort of skepticism.
One of the things that worries me, I suppose, a bit when I think of AI and ESG and the reporting obligations that we have now is that we seem to be moving into a world of sort of quarterly ESG reporting, and ESG change happens over decades, if not half centuries or centuries. And if I have to report and evidence improvements over a very short time frame as a company, it could skew my behavior. It could lead me, I might be operating in areas where I could drive important improvements in countries that are very coal dependent, that maybe have child labor. If I pull out of those countries, none of those two things are necessarily going to change. It's just the only thing that's going to change is that I'm not there, and maybe the children eat less. So how are we going to, yes, reporting might make sense. We might all want to get to the same place. But because we now have these capabilities, for better or worse, that enable us to report, and the demand from regulators and investors that we do report, how are we going to ensure that our behaviors, or the corporate behaviors, are not the same as they are in the financial world, where it's all about delivering a profit in the next 3 months or else?
That's a core, not to talk about Rho Impact, but just collectively a core motto of ours around the ESG reporting is a reflection of the ESG doing. And without the doing, the reporting is either one, greenwashing, fraud, lawsuits, investigations, etc., or you have nothing to show. So the focus on ESG reporting, I think, is a myopic sort of reactive market opportunity that a lot of folks are noticing and trying to capture. But at the end of the day, the quality of your reporting can only be as good as the quality of your doing. And that's why we're really focused on the ESG doing, which makes the reporting more of we like to call it a victory lap to celebrate the great work, but it's really the focus on execution, operational efficiencies, better management in risk management and value creation, and really getting back to how does ESG drive outcomes for this business versus the double materiality concept of how are we impacting the world. So I just want to parse apart the doing from the reporting. And if we can get people focused on the doing, the reporting should be, not as complex as everyone I think is bashing the drum about or fighting against Congress about these days.
Yeah. Although the problem is that we are in an insatiable demand for reporting, for news, for updates, for things to change. And I think knowing that this data can be there and can be updated all the time, we might start to want that. Not we necessarily on this call, but investors, and evidencing change over short timeframes in this area is not going to be an easy ask. You mentioned one word in that I just springs me into another area, which was lawsuit. So where will the lawsuits be in this AI-driven ESG reporting future or ESG future? Who do I, as an investor, who will I have a claim against? Will it be the corporate? Will it be the person that wrote the AI machine that gathered the data? Isabel, I'm going to put that one to you. You don't have an interest here.
No, this is the type of question I would raise with my students, because there's no, especially on an international basis, there's no, as far as I see, there's no legislation that allows us, it's legally still very much country-based rather than internationally available to us. But so it's not something I have a definite answer to.
It's a great question. There have already been lawsuits with respect to greenwashing and claims, but usually it's just because of rudimentary exclusions or problems in the methodologies that that may have been followed. Like Allbirds sort of famously or infamously, there was a lawsuit involving them where I think, if memory serves, they didn't sufficiently account for the wool as part of one of their products as a statement. I think it was either Allbirds or maybe it was Oatly, where it was a shareholder that brought the suit to say, I thought that you had a sustainable product, whatever that means. And then you get into these specific technical definitions, but yeah, it's very unlikely to have been, at least in that instance, an AI debacle, and only something that may have just needed a better methodology or a more comprehensive one. And then we also have on the horizon all of the lawsuits that are about to appear in the United States. At least that's the general feeling, with the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, with the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions accounting rules. And everybody's like lined up, and it's going to take years probably to have that kind of go through. And that doesn't even touch AI. So there are these, my feeling, and this is just a feeling, most of the lawsuits that touch greenwashing or sustainability or ESG are not going to involve AI yet, because it's not a cornerstone of the way it's done there. Could be different in the financial world with investments and like an AI-based ESG indicator. From everything I've read there in that field, ESG has been over applied as a category, and it's indistinguishable from many others. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure with the sort of forward-looking investment space, but in terms of actual lawsuits, a lot of it's attacking more basic methodological questions. Or
so far.
You might want to think as well the other way around. It's about, as a company, I'm, let's say, a very ESG friendly company. I do everything really nice. Yet the AI system says, for one reason or another, that I'm not as ESG friendly as I appear to be. We haven't touched on that perspective. What can I do? If let's say Rho Impact says no good, we're coming back to our green-red scenario, red. And in reality, I, as a company, believe I've been misrepresented. So what can I do against Rho Impact in that case?
That's such a great point, Isabel. And I think, just to not to call anyone out by name here from a company perspective, but this is the trouble that a lot of the third-party rating systems are getting into right now around the black box methodologies and the lack of consistency in scoring application. And a great way to debunk the whole, if you're an investor, you're a B2B customer, anyone using third-party rating systems, you immediately are debunked when you show them any company on 4 or 5 different systems has 4 or 5 different scores. And it's clear as day every time you do this little exercise for anyone that it's across the map and no one can explain it. At the end of the day, we're talking about different data points, different criteria, different weighting systems, different analysts. You're looking at all this variance across the board, but no explanation of or clarity around the why. Why are these things being assessed when they are not materially relevant to the industry, but they're applied to every company you're looking at, et cetera? So I think that notion of context, and if AI can help improve context, great. But right now, the application, particularly on, and I believe the UK is coming out with some really stringent regulator reforms around third-party rating system methodologies, is that they just muck up the whole environment because no one can make sense out of them. And this is just a consistent challenge that we see in our world. And I'd say if you queried some investors who are using a couple of third-party systems, they would say the same. We're getting different scores from different things. No clarity as to the why here.
And can you, to what extent are any of these sort of weighting the three parts of the acronym? Are they looking at the three parts in isolation, or are they looking? I might be doing a lot on social impact, but it's harming my E-score. Are the systems looking across to see a sort of a movement or a performance across the three, interrelating them where they interrelate, or are they looking at the three in as siloed things?
Yeah, I would say all of the above is correct. And also it depends, which is not a great answer, but I'd say it's pretty accurate in the sense of you're looking at some systems that purely are looking at what another rating has said is material relevant to the industry. For example, a lot of party rating systems are derived from the Sustainable Accounting Standards Boards, 77 industry-specific standards, all deemed material from consensus-based, standard building. That typically seems to be a big starting point for a lot of third-party systems. And then you look at others that say, we have our proprietary scoring system, hence black box methodology, and we're only looking at specific issues that we think are material to each company on a case-by-case basis, which, what does that even mean? So that's an inherent challenge out there. And back to how can you get around it? It's really focusing on what's material to the business and, getting back to the fundamentals. Any point chasing, similar, whether it's a lead certification for an asset or we want institutional shareholder services to bump our score up, any of that point chasing is going to result in a lot of resource waste, a lot of energy, and for a score improvement that could quickly shift once the criteria changes. So the fundamentals are what really, in our opinion, is the closest thing you can do to managing the range of inconsistencies in the third-party rating world.
No, and Seth, am I right understanding that Rho Impact at the moment focuses more on, let's say, the E within ESG, more climate impact and more, let's say, quantitative data that is easily capturable by AI, rather than, let's say, more the S of ESG, the social side, where it's a lot of, like, let's say, sentiment analysis that would have to be used to understand various contexts. So I think Rho Impact, and this is where you correct me, but Rho Impact has seen a little bit of a move towards definitely the E side of the ESG.
Yeah, absolutely. And a subcategory that we're especially, we in the field are especially focused on our emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, but there are lots of other metrics that you could look at. And there's just a rich history from environmental science and life cycle analysis and all these other measures. So that's where we're focusing a lot of our efforts with respect to forecasting and the changes that main technological or process changes that would need to go into place in order to kind of have the greatest beneficial impact through time, either for the company itself or for the company downstream of our our own clients. That's true on the environment. That's where a lot of our effort on the IMM side goes, the impact measurement management side. But we certainly touch on the social metrics and the questions about process as well as governance in ESG. But that's more that at least historically for us has been more part of the the process that NOAA and our advisory team works on. So we don't want to give short shrift to those things. It just so happens that a lot of the forecasting models and a lot of attention that our science team pays is to the E. So that's true there, but we ensure that any of this total ESG advice going to our customers and clients includes where materially relevant the social metrics, anything that we can measure or document. That's a big thing for us and it gets back to this point about focusing on the fundamentals. For us, the fundamentals are verifiable documentation. It's evidence. And if you can't draw a clean line between, never mind even a decision that you would want to make in order to correct the path that you're on, just saying, where are you? Like, what's the current status? Being able to draw a clean line from that question all the way back to the evidence that you use to support it, including in the supply chain, is key. And it's only through that uncomfortable interrogation of where the subjective, either shooting from the hip occurred in that modeling or the, fuzziness of that poor assumptions happened that we could actually improve. So it's a lot of, putting a very bright light isn't always complimentary when we're like looking in the mirror,
Right. But I think it does, Isabel, the question is a hugely relevant one, because it is, we're going back to the what gets measured, gets managed. The E is the easiest thing to measure. It's not, I'm not saying it's easy to measure, but of the three of them, it's the easiest to measure. And the other two, fuzziness, do make them, I think, put them into second position quite a lot. I want to talk about data privacy. So we've been thinking in this sort of dirty industrial world without real people in them. But one of the great fears around AI is data privacy. To what extent do we need to be worried about that in your context?
So on the data privacy side, there's a lot. I mean, one of the trends that we see is, like, in general, if you don't know what data should be protected, you just protect all of it. That's the sort of maybe it's an American trend. I'm not sure geographically if that's the general sense. And there's lots of stuff that there's no, as far as I'm concerned, there's no reason. Not only is there no reason to just keep it hidden, there are a lot of good reasons on why you would want to share it. I'll give you one example. Technology taxonomies that people are using, especially investors. It would be better for everybody if we had a cohesive and consistent way of thinking about how technologies are nested into each other and where they meet certain markets. So we're using the same language. It's a kind of basic point. And time again, we see people have their own, come up with, basically through a hodgepodge of various other lists, come up with the list that they feel comfortable with. And that's like one example. Performance data, benchmarking data about like machine performance, if you want to get down to that level. There's a real advantage to sharing some of that so you can figure out how you're doing. At the same time, by really drilling down into data, and we'll often ask questions about IP, things that for information that would be confidential is confidential, because we want to know the facts in order to say how you're doing. And that can be kind of uncomfortable, but it's also something that you're never going to get from like web scraping or something. It's not the true facts on the ground. So we have to protect that kind of data.
So that's more about privacy and confidentiality, confidentiality in the corporate context. But I was thinking more in what about in the personal context?
Personal context. So maybe this is just me being cynical, but I feel like so much of that, like the many of the ships in that fleet have sailed because of smartphones and all the data that we're in, and all the rights that we've given away as individual consumers. And the pity is that the vast majority of that data is just being used to sell more phones or more whatever, just more stuff. I think there could be a real value in a way that, and this is where the ESG principles would need to come in, protects individuals' privacy while providing information on the environmental impact of a set of like decisions in a professional context even that are happening. For personal consumption choices, they're just that, they're personal, but one of the drivers of that may or should be signals that help you decide clearly and trusted signals that help you assimilate that. I mean, as humans, we're great at taking in a lot of data and then making a decision based on nuance and based on complexity and everything. We're like brilliant at that. Not to say that our decisions are always right, but if there's a lack of trust in that signal and it's the E or a social signal or whatever, you disregard it. Or if you're getting a signal that you do trust and that is wrong, then you're likely to make a different choice. And so I feel like it's only at that interface with consumers where there has to be some kind of agreement or some kind of understanding in what you're giving up and what you're getting.
I wanted to come back on the data point we raised before, because it's not just data privacy that I'm interested in, it's data democracy. And so that some people have access to data that others don't have access to. And not just, it could be non-confidential information. It's the idea that coming to satellite images, who has access to those images, who can form information. And I think one aspect that is often underestimated in the ESG environment is who has access to the data. And what are we doing on democratizing the data that is available to all. And again, there's no timeline. Coming back to timings are difficult. What's the future going to look like? But I think it's all those little things that we have to start to work on if we wanted to achieve more equality in the field of ESG.
Yeah, and AI. Otherwise, it will be the same people developing all the AI if they're the only people with access to the data. I'm really sorry, but that's all we've got time for. I think this is a very short session, I'm afraid, and a very big subject. So we'll have to get you back to delve further into this very rich subject. But for the meantime, thank you very much indeed, Isabel, Noah, and Seth. That's the end of this Core Insights episode. It was brought to you by the Gillmore Centre for Financial Technology at Warwick Business School. Again, thank you to my guests, Noah, Isabel, and Seth. I hope to see you back again. I will be back with another episode exploring the big issues in fintech. If you listeners want to keep up to date with the latest research, thinking, and issues in the fintech sector, be sure to sign up to the Core Insights newsletter, which will deliver all the analysis you need direct to your inbox. And subscribe to the Core Insights podcast as well, so you don't miss the next episode in this fintech series, again brought to you by Warwick Business School's Gillmore Centre for Financial Technology. Thank you.